Welcome everyone, and in particular, welcome to you, John.
Thank you.
We start this webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet. I also acknowledge our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move in unity to an Australia that is fair and just for all its Indigenous peoples. And the opening prayer that I will say is the traditional Australian YCW prayer, which is really a worker's prayer. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and all my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, farms, workshops, offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere, better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us forever from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labor's battlefield rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Over to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Brian. Well, I think that prayer is a great way to start off introducing our topic today, which is the Hour of the Working Class, Joseph Cardijn's famous lecture series of 1948, which of course was a critical time in the world history after the great Second World War. And we've invited John Médaille from Dallas, Texas, to join us today. John is in the rather unique position, being somebody who retired into the teaching profession at an age when he says sensible people were retiring out of it. After a 40-year career in business, he was asked by the University of Dallas to establish a course in Catholic social teaching for business students. The University of Dallas is unique in that it requires its business students to have a working knowledge of the social encyclicals of the Catholic Church. John developed his course and has taught it since 2004. In his time as an academic, he has published 3 books: The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace, Towards a Truly Free Market, A Distributive Perspective, and Theology, Mythos or Logos, with a co-author, Thomas Stork. In addition, he's written articles or introductions for a dozen other books, and he's the father of 5, the grandfather of 3, and he says the husband of 1. And she is Christine Copper Médaille, and he's been married to Christine for 50 years. So that's also deserving of congratulations to both of you, John, and we're really very pleased to have you with us today in different time zones, different parts of the world. And so we look forward to hearing to your perspective on Cardijn's Hour of the Working Class. Thanks very much, John.
Stefan, thank you. And I want to thank the young Catholic workers and this group from around the world for hearing me this evening or this morning, depending upon where you are. Now, in examining Joseph Cardijn's The Hour of the Working Class, one could do worse than to use the format that he himself pioneered in doing the preparatory work for Pope John the 23rd's Mater et Magistra, the Look, Judge, Act format. As it was stated in the encyclical, there are 3 stages which should normally be followed in the reduction of social principles into practice. First, one reviews the concrete situation. Secondly, one forms a judgment in the light of these same principles. Thirdly, one decides what in the circumstances can and should be done to implement these principles. These are the 3 stages that are usually expressed in the 3 terms: look, judge, act. The look part reflects his insistence that we start with realities. What is actually happening on the ground? What are people and communities experiencing? And what difficulties do they face? This is a look apart from ideologies, a clear-eyed gaze at the actual circumstances of actual people in their communities. Only by starting on the ground, as it were, can we begin the process of judgment, knowing that we are connected to the realities of the situation rather than to abstractions which may or may not be relevant. The second phase, the judgment, is something larger than ideology or rooted in a particular economic or social or political view. More properly, we can call it a cultural judgment, because culture both unites and transcends the particular social, economic, political, social, and sociological elements. But most importantly, it is a transcendent view, reaching always to an ideal. For some, this may be an historical ideal, as in certain political forms of atheism, such as Marxism. But for most cultures, it is an ideal of the transcendent God. Capitalism is alone, I believe, in lacking such a transcendence, or worse, privatizing it. But it is unique in that regard, an historical outlier. And finally, there is action. For the purpose of judging the world is not merely to understand it, but to change it. Action here is not the application of ideology, but arises from the realities, and so is practical and prudential. It is never the mere imposition of a plan from above, but from action from below. The actions to be taken are highly dependent upon the actual circumstances and possibilities that each concrete situation offers. The 4 parts of the Hour of the Working Class fit this format very well, with part 1 forming Cardijn's look at the current situation of the worker, part 2 his judgment on that situation, and parts 3 and 4 his plan of action to address the problem. Part 1 deals with the movement of production from the home and workshop into factories, a movement made possible by the early use of wind, water, and tidal mills dating back to the Middle Ages, but now given real impetus, but not given real impetus until the invention of the steam engine in 1769. This allowed for 3 great transformations, which totally changed the nature of work and the economic order upon which we all depend. The first change was the movement from the workshop into the factory. Now, the factory differs from the workshop in several fundamental dimensions. The first is that the idea of technology itself changed. Previously, technological advances tended to improve the power of the craftsman. The flying shuttle, for example, empowered the weaver to accomplish more, and the spinning jenny allowed the spinner to supply the weaver with more thread. But in both cases, the worker, the spinner or the weaver, remained the master and mistress of the process, and the output was a result of their skill and an expression of their pride in their work. The steam engine changed all that. The first effect was that instead of the tool serving the worker became the servo mechanism of the tool. Just that little bit of the process that, as yet, had not been automated. Craftsmanship was replaced by repetition, so that a worker merely repeated the same operation over and over and over again. In noting how this looks in a clothes factory, Cardijn notes that individual workers every day do nothing more than sew one detail of the suit. Thus, the craftsman, the possessor of skill, intelligence, and vision, becomes nothing more than a mindless mechanism and one waiting to be made obsolete by new and better machinery. The second effect arises from the fact that the new machinery is highly expensive. A craftsman could reasonably aspire to acquiring his own tools and setting up his own shop. His capital requirements were modest and within the reach of most men. But the new machines required the capitalist as the intermediary standing between the worker and the tools he needed. This led to the third transformation, namely that, quote, an ever-growing number of workers became dependent upon wages for their livelihood. This dependency was total. As Cardijn put it, wage labor gave rise to a whole complexity of problems, not because they were socialists or communists, but because there was machinery and wages. Because there were and are millions and millions of workers working away from their families in conditions determined by their work. At the beginning, there was nothing they could say. They would come down to the gates of the factory. Is there work for me? Yes, over there. How much? So much. How many hours? So many hours. You don't like it? Then move on. The whole system was supported by a liberalism that liberated the owners of capital not only from any public controls, it liberated them from any religious duty to the workers. As Cardijn puts it, economic and political liberalism gave birth to a religious liberalism, whose cry was that these things had nothing to do with the church. Its sphere was exclusively religious. It would be usurpation for it to interfere in questions of wages and conditions of work. And there were some Catholic employers and intellectuals caught up in the liberalism of the day who closed their eyes to all this. They allowed themselves to be deceived by economic, political, philosophic, and religious liberalism, and they abandoned the working class. The result was exploitation, destitution, and suffering. Indeed, the working class itself was a creation of the newly liberated state, liberated from ancient religious and social duties. It began with the privatization of common land, the enclosure of the commons, a move which Karl Polanyi called the revolution of the rich against the poor. This made the small family farm unprofitable and forced people into the cities to find work. It continued with the criminalization of poverty in a welfare reform that in England ended the public relief given by the Elizabethan Poor Laws and the establishment of the notorious workhouses in which families were segregated and children required to work at the treadmill from the age of 4. It even criminalized the act of quitting your job before the end of your employment contract in the Masters and Servants Act of 1823. The masters, of course, were not bound to continue to employ you if, in their judgment, conditions no longer warranted it. But far from being freed from government control, liberalism extended the control of the state, displacing arrangements that had for centuries been controlled by custom, common law, and ancient usage, and replacing them with an ever-growing state bureaucracy upon which the new class of capitalists depended, and an ever-growing empire which assured access to cheap raw materials and even cheaper labor. On the farm and in the craft shop, there was a more or less natural division of labor between men and women. But as Cardijn notes, the sex of the worker was of no concern of the machine. Men and women were alike, end quote. And deploying women and children had two effects. One, they were easier to exploit and mistreat. And two, employing them raised the supply of labor, thereby lowering its price. Cardijn continues, women were employed in steelworks and heavy industry, and not women only. Even 7-year-old children, unable to read or write, who had not yet made their first communion, were forced down into the mines to push small trucks. Children of 7, 8, 9, 10 at work, a shame to humanity. It was all due to economic liberalism, which paid no respect to the human person and the family, and whose sole aim was profit and production. The result is not only the deterioration of family life, which becomes, while families become a middle and upper class indulgence, but a complete reorienting of society to the requirements of the machine. Excuse me. Requirements that take no account of family life and gender roles. Indeed, many, if not most, of the debates we have on these issues today spring precisely from the disgendered nature of mass production, which itself produces a society where sex and gender is reduced to a private preoccupation or even just a pleasant pastime. Among the many other effects of mass production, there is one that Cardijn does not mention, but which I think is critical to the debate. The plain fact of the matter is that mass production contains an internal contradiction. A single factory can, in principle, be capable of meeting the needs of an entire nation in a relatively short period of time. But once everybody has one, the factory cannot survive, cannot pay its capital costs on replacements and population growth alone. Faced with this conundrum, the industrialists realized that they had to shift from creating products to creating consumers. Desires had to be elevated over needs because needs are unprofitable, but desires are endless. As Paul Mazur, CEO of the investment bank Lehman Brothers, put it, we must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. This new man created by consumer culture can have anything he wants except happiness. He must always be wanting and never be content, because contentment would be the death of consumerism, and hence the death of industrial capitalism. He must always seek his happiness in things rather than in persons, and then seek them again in some other thing. But he must never be allowed to become content. Contentment would destroy the consumer culture. He must be taught to forget what he owns and to accept that it won't last very long, even if it could be made, as most things can be made, to last for decades. Indeed, he must even be denied the right to repair what he owns, and products must be made to be more and more temporary. People must be made to be forever dependent upon the machine culture. In part 2, Cardijn begins his judgment with the observation that, quote, the church without the working class is not the church of our Lord Jesus. This is directly contrary to the claims of liberalism, which separate the religious and economic orders. But this imposes some mutual obligations on both the church and the working class. This problem imposes some obligations. These may be summarized as: 1, the working class must know its vocation, and further, it must know that it is a divine vocation. 2, in order to fulfill this mission, the working class must have an organization. 3, the working class needs leaders who are really apostles and missionaries. And 4, and this might be the most important point, the working class must be given a positive doctrine about life, about work, about the family, which will enable it to know why it is on earth and how great and noble is its mission, which will make it proud to be working class, courageous in work, and morally strong to overcome the difficulties in the life of workers. But Cardijn notes that there is another group that has already done these things for the working class, and that is the communists. For this reason, he insists that we must see the element of truth in communism. Marx and communism gave a mission to the working class, he says. It teaches the working class that it has a divine mission on earth, a redemptive, a messianic mission, end quote. And it is in regard to communism that Cardijn finds the church's response inadequate. Unfortunately, he says, we study its negative side and leave out its positive side. We study in Divini Redemptori the arguments against communism, and that is all. The more important part is that dealing with the remedies and the alternatives to communism, that is usually ignored. Here, Cardijn is confronting a real problem in the church of that time. For while the 20th century brought a new awareness of the problems of capitalism, and particularly in regard to the working class, that was the result of a long internal struggle, and one which was far from complete in his day, and frankly is far from complete today. The church in the 18th and 19th centuries had turned inward on itself after the disastrous wars of religion, and particularly after its loss of political influence after the French Revolution. Although a few bishops addressed the problems of the working class, bishops like Archbishop Kettler in Germany and Cardinal Manning in England, the church mostly ignored the problems of working people. Even Leo XIII, famous for his pioneering Rerum Novarum in 1891, was a reluctant convert. His first social encyclical, Quod Apostolici Muneris, written in 1878, that is 13 years before Rerum Novarum, did not even mention workers, but spoke of the problem in terms of masters and servants, with the servants owing to the masters the same obedience that wives owed to their husbands or children to their parents. And he defended the gross and artificial inequalities of the day as natural. Needless to say, this is not the sort of rhetoric that would appeal to the working class. In part 3, Cardijn defines the characteristics of the workers' movement, and he finds 3 things are necessary. The first and foremost is that it must be educative. And why? Because the workers must take responsibility for the running of industry. He says, we have arrived at a decisive stage. The working class must accept responsibility and take part in the running of industry and industrial concerns. But if the working class is not formed and educated, if it has not been taught to accept responsibility, if it does not understand industry and national and international economy, then it will be unable to fulfill its responsibility of sharing in the running of each country in the world. The greatest danger facing the working class today is ignorance. At this point, Cardijn's workers' movements become indistinguishable from things like distributism or cooperativism, which give ownership and responsibility to the workers. This also erases the gap between capital management and labor, which Pope St. John Paul II would later identify as the goal of any just economic system. The second requirement is that the movement is apostolic. It cannot be concerned merely with natural things, but must recognize its supernatural dimension, precisely that dimension that was excised by economic liberal theories. And this is tied very strongly to Cardijn's refusal to separate the spiritual and the temporal ends of man. None of us can or does exist solely in one or the other of these realms. We are human by being part of both. On the one hand, an apostolic movement must have as its first concern the eternal destiny of the working class, its divine origin, the divine value of the life of each worker and each worker's family. The working class must be made to realize this. But on the other, the spiritual must be incarnate in the temporal. The third requirement is that the movement must be missionary. And by this, Cardijn means that it must be about action. Quote, in the training of young workers, the first thing is not to lecture them. That must come later, but never at first, because they will not understand. We start by giving them responsibilities, actions to be done, and we must go on doing it. All formation depends on it. The sense of responsibility must be developed. The way to form them is to give them activities they can do to serve the youth in the district. Can they do anything for those they travel to work with? Always activities and responsibilities. They don't always understand immediately why you do it, because they do not realize that it is an apostolate. In part 4, Cardinal Cardijn offers us a choice. Faced with working class movements that were, at the time, largely led by socialists or even communists, he says, we must study this problem in such a way that it will no longer be true to say that it is only the socialists who understand the workers' problem. We must so study it that Christian working men and women, can say that we understand the workers' problem better than the socialists and the communists, because in our movement, we have studied it and solved it. And he leaves us with this warning. I have said that the working class needs a workers' movement. It will be communist or Christian, one or the other. The day that Catholics and Christians understand the need for a workers' movement, they will see that this workers' movement must be built. It is not enough to pray for it and to go to communion. It is also necessary to build. If you want a house, you can pray. But if you do not build it, there will be no house. Merely being anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-modernist, anti-liberal is never enough. There must be a real alternative. And the young Christian workers must play their part, which I believe is the key part in building it. This is your mission. This is your apostolate. This is your vocation. But along with this vocation, there is another task, and that is to free ourselves from the consumerist ideal, to cease being what this society wants us to be, creatures of desire who seek their happiness in things and who desire nothing more than to acquire ever new things and follow ever-changing fads and fashions. Rather, we must know that our happiness and our destiny is tied to our relationship to persons, first to family, then to community, then to nation, but ultimately to the whole world. And the change we seek for the world must first occur within each and every one of us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, John, for that wonderful recap of Cardijn's teaching on the hour of the working class, and also for your way of relating it to the developments since then, the development of our consumer society and the challenges we face today in a machine culture that we live in. Now it's all our opportunity to pipe up or ask a question. So is there anybody that would like to speak? I can't see you all on screen. So would you be able, if anybody does have a question, feel free to join, feel free to speak it or to put it in the chat. I have a concrete question. John, how do you see the existence of the working class, for example, in Australia, in a country like Australia or the USA today? There's been a kind of, certainly from an Australian point of view, I would say a great decline of class consciousness, as it used to be called. How do you see the existence of class in a consumer culture?
Oh, yeah, I think it's even, I see two movements. One, it's even more serious than it has been in the past. And two, consciousness of it is submerged. Okay, there's a number of ways this is accomplished. One is since the so-called culture wars. All right, so we're going to debate a lot about, sexuality or pronouns or immigration or things that I won't say that they're non-issues, but let's just say they're highly volatile issues, but they may not have the importance that people think they have. And so people get caught up in those kinds of debates. The second is a phony populism, and you saw that very, very much with, say, Donald Trump. Who is a very wealthy man who presents himself as if he were working class. And what does he do? Well, he does precisely what I said before. He harps on cultural issues which bear very, very little relationship to the problem. However, I think this strategy, although it worked for a while, I think it's working even less and less. Matter of fact, just today, having a discussion with somebody from the professional class, computer engineer, and there's been huge layoffs in the United States, and I suspect in Australia and Europe, of professional workers, computer engineers and the like. Okay. And in fact, that's doing this in face of record profits in these companies. What I think is going on is that the professional class, which sort of put itself above all of these concerns, so they weren't working class, because they were being paid so well and had so many benefits, they're being disciplined. They're being disciplined by the masters to show them who is really in charge, and that they can no longer expect the privileged position they have. So perhaps it's time for the professional classes to realize that they really always were just working class, okay, no matter how good their pay was. And perhaps on this realization, okay, we can build a broader and broader coalitions. But I don't know, somebody with more experience in that will have to tell me.
Yes. What, anybody else like to make a comment or ask a question? Another aspect I was going to follow you up on, I'm not trying to speak over anybody, so if you do wish to speak, please feel free to do so. But so that we keep going, I will ask another question, and that is, you mentioned that also Leo XIII in his first encyclical, which was very interesting, 1878, which I think is little known, certainly to me, and his lack of, let's say, worker consciousness in that encyclical. What do you think of more recent encyclicals? Do you think, because from my point of view, I kind of think that there's possibly a lack of worker consciousness in recent church teaching. What do you think on that?
That's very interesting you should say that, because I was thinking just the opposite, that that it is in Francis especially, but also in John Paul and in Benedict, even Caritas in Veritate, certainly. However, I think maybe perhaps you're thinking, and don't let me put words in your mouth, is that it lacked the vocabulary that one would have expected from a workers' movement. But I think all the elements are absolutely there. All of the what I would call anti-liberalism, I would prefer to say anti-capitalism, but it's perhaps better to say anti-liberalism, is certainly present in nearly all of the, I would say all of the encyclicals since Mater et Magister, certainly in Populorum Progressio, certainly in Solicitudo Socialis, with these that take the issue to the international level. But Caritas in Veritate, Centesimus Annus, Fratelli Tutti, I would say these are a good basis for a working class movement.
Okay, I'll just kind of respond. Yes, I must admit I was thinking a little bit of, we had a plenary council in Australia over the last 2 years, or in the last 2 years, and it was one of the points actually we tried to work on was to introduce some worker consciousness, because even the church seemed to have a fairly internal view. There were ministers in the church who were working for the church, but it was kind of not specified, let's say, that most people in families actually are working outside the church in, well, not necessarily factories anymore, but service organisations, government, everything like that. And that aspect, certainly from my point of view, seemed to be neglected. Yeah, but I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, but we do have another question here from Ashish Cholagain. Ashish is the full-time worker for the YCW in Adelaide. Ashish, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, Stephen, thank you so much. John, just a context to it. Last May in 2022, we gathered young workers who were involved in YCW all over the Australia, basically from 5 states, to come together and then discuss about worker consciousness. One of the things that we experienced was they were struggling to define working class. They were struggling to define or identify whether they belong to a working class. And that's where the really interesting discussion started to happen, because we were also jointly hearing about some of the young workers from Philippines, and the context was different. And then some of the reality was some people are earning high, but in terms of, like the different economy, they're now gig economy, there are other economics there, but the earning is high, but the working condition is not that good. Or the working condition, in that context, where your earning necessarily does not, determine your class as such. So the question was, what are the factors, what are the determinants at the present context we need to look into when we are describing working class, and what would be the right word, or what would be the right thing to tell them in terms of helping them identify if they belong to working class? Because we had a group of 50 people, and when we asked them question, do you think you belong to a working class? And there was a big pause, there was a big silence.
Well, I'm not surprised by this. Let me start by telling you what I think the working class is. What characterizes the working class is dependency. Okay, and dependency in the sense of not only are they dependent upon the wage, but their jobs have no security to them. Now, an engineer can be relatively secure, a tenured professor can be secured, etc., and still, and they're dependent upon their wage, but they have some security in work. But there's also a sort of cultural, I don't want to use the word snobbery, but another word doesn't occur to me right now, that, well, I'm an engineer, not like those people working outside. So, but and I think we had this conversation before you came. There's been this mass layoff of professional workers in the United States, and I would be surprised if it's not occurring in everybody's country. These huge layoffs, even though these companies are as profitable or more profitable than ever. And what I think is going on is that the professional class, which has enjoyed enormous privileges up to this point, is being disciplined. They're being told that they are in fact dispensable and replaceable. Okay, and they had better moderate their demands. So, well, that is very bad, but at the same time, it can be used to bring the consciousness to them that they are in fact dependent. I mean, they're not, their education is a possession, a kind of capital which they can use, but they still don't own the tools to make their own living. They don't have a voice in their own companies. They don't have, something like Mondragon, or they don't have co-determination as in Europe, but they don't have a real voice in the company. And so it's time to recruit this professional managerial class into the working class, because in fact they are working class. They may be very comfortable working class, but they are still working class. And so we've got to kind of join hands some way. Now, I don't know how to do that, especially in this space of, a certain snobbery. But I think it needs to be done. That's a good problem for the Josists.
Yes, I think there's a lot of work for the Josists. Again, if anybody else would like to pipe up, feel free to do so. But I was going to follow up again, if you don't mind, on that question of, well, actually, perhaps I'll be more precise about not so much that's lacking in Catholic social teaching about kind of a theology of work or workers. But
I think Anita has a question, I think.
Oh, Anita, great. Okay, Anita, I'll let you go. Sorry.
Sorry, it was probably in keeping with what you're saying. I wonder if, and with Ashish's description, and also, as you say, the professional people have been put off. I wonder if rather than working class I think in this day and age, that just whether people are happy to be described as a worker actually, rather than part of the working class, or even class mentioned, and with the tail end of Cardijn's in his time with young Christian workers. Just in our local group here, there's a little group of Muslim kids who have been encouraged to come together, see which kids have gone on okay in jobs, and get those employers sharing their information and get those young ones together and see if they can support each other. And the third thing was that the step here was to encourage all workers, even say to the extent of cleaners in factories or wherever there were offices and workshops, wherever they were, to have their own business number. They weren't allowed to be a worker. They had to be a business. And even though they might have only been cleaning in one building and they were going 4 hours here, or if it was more than one place, 4 hours there, they had to have their own business number. Now that, I think, led to people being isolated, not at their own volition, but that layer, and I think with the people working in professionals from home and from remotely and from anywhere in the all over the world, that everyone was seeing themselves as individuals, because not just because they thought they were, but they have been encouraged to, so that they are then vulnerable, when they are sacked or not sacked or whatever, disciplined. Yeah.
Oh wow, Anita, that's you have. I think you've brought up a whole bunch of things there that are very, very interesting. I'm not even sure where to start, but I think one, yes, the idea of class itself, many people regard as suspicious because it tends to have originated in Marxist polemics. And so it has that association. At the same time, I think the concept is useful because it is in fact a class. That is a descriptor which applies to a large group of people and kind of defines them more or less economically, and I would say even socially. Okay, so, but there are absolutely difficulties with the term. I don't know what the answer to that is, but yeah, that's, but maybe this is an opportunity to make people realize that, well, you were working class all along. If you have a big car and a 3,000 square foot house, don't ask me how many square meters that is. I don't know. But I was kind of interested about this forcing people to have their own business numbers when obviously they really didn't have a business, except, and the only property they had was their own labor. That is a new, I think it's a tool of manipulation. That's what it sounds like to me.
It is.
And so it may be a way to deliberately destroy sort of that class consciousness. So, but Marx had the problem. I mean, the Marxists, the early socialists, had the problems of building the class consciousness. It was a little bit easier because it was the idea of class. I say it was Marxist, but it was also, aristocratic. It was also bourgeois. So Marx is responding to something that's already there, but we don't like to call ourselves bourgeois. We certainly don't want to think of ourselves as aristocrats, and yet we have now we don't have aristocrats. We have something a little bit worse called celebrities. So everybody wants to be a celebrity, but nobody wants to admit class. So
Okay.
you said a bunch of interesting things there that I'm going to have to think about.
No, I don't want. I'm just it just occurs to me that way. But the other thing is the business, the fellow who or woman who opens up a business still works alongside the workers, maybe treating them nicely or maybe exploiting them, but still sees themselves as a worker because they're doing the hard work still. But there is an avenue for them to see anyone not working just as hard as they are, or dispensing them with them when the money runs out, or how that. So does that person see themselves as a worker and a boss and a business owner? And in Australia, that's very, I would say, and probably America too, or anywhere, it's a very common in the population, very, very common. I don't mean an answer to it. I just mean that the conundrum of seeing people identifying, but then if you go to Malaysia and see the people building the roads and the sleeping on the site, where they're building the roads and separated from their families, not only Malaysia, of course, but separated from their families for years when the family was supposed to join them 2 years later, and that's where is that working person's life in the whole description? Yeah.
All right. Well, there's a lot of questions. I'll interrupt you, John.
No.
I see a lot of questions. I see a lot of questions on the screen now. So I think Greg was the first one, and then there's Jim Monahan and Matthew, and I think Anthony's also got one. So yes, the discussion's really picking up now. Greg, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, John. I was just interested to know the profile of your students in this course that you teach. And also, what happens, like post their graduation, like, what kind of impact they have in society, and if the university measures, kind of the impact that this program is having. Thank you, John.
I'm sorry, Greg. Could you speak just a little bit louder? I don't think I got all of that.
Okay, sorry. Is this better?
Yes.
Is this better? Yeah. I just wanted to know the profile of your students in the course that you teach, and what happens to them once they graduate, and if the university or your department measures the social impact of this course. Thank you.
No, that excellent question. We are a middle class to upper middle class Catholic university. So our student body tends to be homogenous. Okay. So homogenous middle class Catholics. However, that provides my teaching challenge, because when I first start the course, one, it's a requirement for a business degree, but they don't understand why it's required. And two, as far as they're concerned, at the beginning of the course, I might just as well be Karl Marx talking about, social justice. And that's why I take very care to get in my teaching costume and dress like a banker. Say there's a real point to do it, to looking this way. But I am happy to say that by the end of the course, they are, I would say, 95% believers, because it does appeal to their latent Catholicism. There is that's stronger than their class interest. All right. They don't even know they had a class interest. Okay. And at the end of the course, I think I'm very, very, I can make that judgment from my student evaluations, which are very, very strong. They are, in fact, I'm proud to say they're off the charts. Okay. For a course that they did want to be in the first place, And I have to say, this also changed radically after 2008. 2008, there was a different realization among students. Now, none of my current students have any real memory of 2008, but nevertheless, that legacy is still there, and it's still part of everything. As far as does the university measure the effects? Alas, it does not. I maintain friendships with students that go back, now almost 2 decades. So I get to see occasionally some effects, but as far as being able to have a measure of that, alas, I do not.
Great, thanks, John. Jim Monahan has a question. Jim has been a long-time YCW chaplain in Australia. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Stefan. Hey, John, I loved your talk, and one part that really made me come alive was hearing you talk about Cardijn's emphasis on educating the workers so that they would know that they have the responsibility and are capable of taking the responsibility. And just a little anecdote from a week ago, I had a funeral with a family who are very, very marginal to the church, and they were kind of trying to think who could do a reading and read the prayers of the faithful, and they hit upon this young girl who was baptized as a baby in another church, but hadn't been to any church services since that time, and but they knew she was in the YCW. She was quite a marginal member of the YCW, but something about that sense of being a young worker had touched her heart, and when they asked her, she sort of felt to say yes, and she just checked with me half an hour before the funeral if I got it right, and she read it out to me from the piece of paper I'd given her. Piece of paper was all creased and covered in stained orangey red, because she said, I must have read it at least 80 times. Every time I pull up in my truck to be loaded up with iron ore in the mine, I take it out and I practice it a couple of times. And then I take that load of ore and then I come back, and while I'm waiting, I practice it again. And something in her connections with the family told them that she would be able to do it, and something in her told her that something she'd never done before she would be able to do, and she just did it beautifully on the day. And that sense of a young worker who has a unique dignity and an eternal dignity and so on, and can be relied on to take responsibility. It was just, I was moved by what you said. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. In the regard to this, once you gave her a task, then that task was so serious to her. I mean, it sounded, that was just a wonderful story. I want to refer to 2 books, though, as far as giving the workers responsibility to run a company. And if you might be familiar with these works already, but I would recommend Jack Stack's A Stake in the Outcome. Now, Jack Stack runs the Springfield Remanufacturing Company, and this is a company that the employees run the company, okay? And they also have ownership of the company through the legal formula in this country is the employee stock ownership plan. In fact, employees turn out to be very, very good managers, excellent managers, once they know how to read the books. So the first thing is the very practical task of teaching them how to read a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement. Once they know this, they can figure it out for themselves. They know what their department contributes. They know what they contribute. And you need very little management because they do the managing themselves. They discipline any worker who's holding them back, A second book in regard to that is Ricardo Semler's The 7-Day Weekend. And he runs Semco of Brazil. He inherited it, didn't want to run it, so he let the workers run it. And it turns out to be this fantastically successful enterprise. So those 2 books, Jack Stack's The Stake in the Outcome, Ricardo Semler's The 7-Day Weekend, excellent sources on how giving the workers responsibilities results exactly Cardijn's plan. results in stronger companies, stronger workers, stronger communities. So I recommend those sources very highly.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I see Matthew's got a question. Matthew, over to you.
Can you hear me?
And now,
Yes.
Excellent. So, my question is maybe beyond the scope of what you are talking about here tonight, which is fine, and it's admittedly dosed with a little bit of cynicism. Because we are potentially talking about with the need for a workers' movement, we're potentially talking about, to use Marx's terms, a capitalism eating itself. Does the good cardinal write anything about having the Catholic worker movement, as Dorothy Day would have called it, move into the arena of political outcomes without it delving into, as certainly, John, as you and I saw here in the States, the co-opting of the hijacking of these ideas, or dare I even say the bastardizing of these ideas into economic populism, which then just took a nosedive into authoritarianism.
Sure.
Does the cardinal talk anything about, again, the need for this movement and capitalism eating itself into real concrete, meaningful political outcomes?
I'm going to defer that question to Stefan.
Okay.
Well, okay. Others feel free to answer too from your own experience of the YCW or other movements based on the See, Judge and Act. Well, I mean, there's been
Stefan, I'm not familiar. So John and I very recently know each other, and he posted this event, and I had not heard, admittedly, I had not heard of the good cardinal. I can't remember how to pronounce his last name. That's how new he is to my knowledge. So I'm not familiar with any of the terms you're using.
Okay. Well, I mean, we could have another webinar on this. We can sometime if you'd like to. But anyway, I'll give you a very simple answer if I can.
Okay.
And that is, you remember, you would have heard John speak at the start of the See or Look, Judge, Act method. Well, the origin of that is actually Aristotle. Aristotle looked at how do politicians come to make decisions, and he saw that, well, first of all, they see what's happening, then they kind of come to a judgment, and finally they come to a decision, not necessarily an action. He talked about making a decision, but in a democratized, and actually the second generation, or actually the origin of the See, Judge, Act was another French philosopher who, at the end of the 19th century, Leon Ollie Leprune, and he saw that society was democratizing. So therefore, it wasn't just political leaders who had to notice how to see and judge and act, but everybody in a democratic society needed to learn to see, judge and act. So that is the kind of origin. And in fact, the first movement to take this up was another French movement called, in English, the Faro, in French, Le Sillon. And their task, as they identified it, was to build democracy. That's how they identified their task. And in fact, if you know the Catholic worker, you mentioned the Catholic worker, Pierre Morin, or Peter Morin, as he's known in the USA, used to belong to that Sion movement in France before he moved over to the US. So there is a political connection. But as a movement, for example, the Young Christian Worker has never been a political movement in the sense of a party political movement. On the other hand, many former members have moved into the political arena. So that's kind of the simple answer.
John will support, we're not talking about economics or politics, we're talking about both.
Correct.
What? We're talking about what?
Both.
Oh, yeah.
Two sides of the
I was
same
going to say, I think we need to make a distinction here where the movement is always political. I think when people confuse the political and the partisan. Okay, so it may not be, it is always political, because the political, the social, the economic, the religious cannot be really separated. So it is political. It may not be associated with this or that party. So yeah, that's, in that sense, it is non-political, but it is always political.
Right.
Always. Mhm.
I see that Anthony also has a question, been waiting a while now. Anthony, over to you.
Thank you, by the way.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I always have difficulty when I ask questions because I make them too complex. So I'll try to kind of do my best with the question. The comments earlier from Anita also made me think as well, just about this, the gig economy. Generally, people, it is desirable to be self-employed. It's a lot of work, but it's generally, for people, it's desirable. But in the situation where you're self-employed, but you're highly dependent, like an employee, that's been called sham contracting in Australia. Those laws have, as I understand it, I don't know the intricacies of exactly where it's at, been watered down. So you're getting more people who are self-employed but are highly dependent, like the cleaners, Anita, that you mentioned, going from different site to different site, and just in the same way as those people sort of turning up to the factory for the day and seeing what was available to them, highly dependent, and really aren't in a position to negotiate their terms and conditions as they would be if it was a fully fledged business. My question or comment about this is, I feel that maybe, and it's really hard to figure out strategies in this space, but a way of maybe working with this situation is to associate those self-employed people through forming their own entities. Now, that might be cooperative or some other form, where you're getting some of the benefits of being self-employed, but you've also got the benefits of being with other people in a similar profession. So you kind of, it's a bit guildish. I'm wondering is, when we look at listed companies and the power of them and the wealth and the influence that they have, are these sorts of ideas just, I find them attractive, but I just wonder if they're a little bit not realistic or maybe a bit utopian. Any comments I'd really value.
Yes, I think the gig economy is, I would say it's faux entrepreneurship. They're not really workers. They're not really business owners. They're just contract workers. And as such, they are even more exploited than even regular workers are. So they live by the telephone. Their most important tool is the cell phone because they're on call at any time. And nobody has any responsibility to them. They have no share in the enterprises that they're building up through their contract labor. So it's a rather kind of parallel, perverse parallel of real entrepreneurship. You suggested some possible solutions and having them join together, but that's very difficult for them because by their very nature they're spread. So I don't know the answer to that question. California just had a big fight when Uber was required to treat their drivers as employees. On the other hand, there is a use for gig employees for people taking this huge capital investment, which everybody has to have today, and that is the automobile, a thing we use an hour a day, depending upon our commute times, we use this an hour a day, but you have to have one at home and you have to have one to go to work. You have this huge capital investment, and it's idle, 90% of the time. And so like Uber drivers can convert that at their convenience to work and to cash. So there's an advantage there to the worker. But it's hard to, and the same thing is with people who have spare rooms for B&B, but then B&B becomes where big corporations or entrepreneurs buy up homes, and not to rent out spare rooms, but to rent out the whole house. And so driving up the cost of housing for everybody. So there's some tough issues there that are frankly beyond me. But the first part is laying out these problems. And there certainly are problems.
Just quickly, the thing I'd follow up is there is some hope around, and there are some examples where gig economy workers have formed a platform that they own together. So including in the taxi area, and some isolated examples around renting out the home spare room and that sort of stuff. But I just struggle. I'm working on it, but I just don't know how, just because it takes a significant amount of money and also political action to really counter these parasitic platforms. Sure. But thank you for the answer, John.
And Paul Gunham has an interesting comment on the chat about that. Paul would like to speak up there, but he has an interesting comment on the chat. And again, I don't know what the answer there is, but it's an interesting set of problems that are probably, in a sense, a creation of, I suspect, of the cell phone. That you couldn't have this without the cell phone. So it's an interesting way that a new technology has interacted with these things. But boy,
well, I was just going to say, yes, let's ask Paul if he'd like to speak to that comment he's got on the chat. And then also there's Mark Hager who's got a question. So Paul, over to you if you'd like to.
Thank you, Stefan. Look, my thing is when you're sort of reaching out to young people to get involved in See Judge Act type of actions, they don't get what we're saying because they don't understand when we talk about working class. So they're not able, they think that we're talking about something of an old generation. And in fact, it's almost like we've got to bring the YCW language up to the modern day because they're just not connecting with what we're saying. So how do we connect in with younger person's language to make them realise that it's them we're talking about, not something their parents or grandparents used to be into, something they read in a history book. This is current, modern, today. You are suffering as a result of what's happening in the working place. I can't seem to be able to get that across to them in my interactions.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a challenging question. I don't know if anybody would like to speak to that, John or others.
Well, again, as I said before, I don't have the answer to that, but it is a real problem. However, I think there is a bridge to reach out to those people, because I think they are having problems, and so the problem is showing them that their problems connect to the whole overall problem, and that again, there is such an effort to divide us and keep our class consciousness from forming, or allow a class consciousness to form over trivial things like opposition to immigration or something like that, or opposition to gay people or something, some subsidiary issue that they're happy to see us argue about, and they don't care which side we take, so long as we keep ourselves busy with those kinds of issues. But we have to get beyond that, and we have to talk to them and find a way, find the words, find the means. But I think that's going to become an easier task as the problems become more and more evident.
Mark, you've got a question.
Hello, John. My name is Mark. I'm sorry that you can't see me, but my knowledge of technology is really bad. I can use the mute, but I don't know how to put myself on the video. I remember when I was in the Young Christian Workers, there was a woman in our group, and she was studying nursing, and she eventually passed her nursing, and she became a nurse supervisor. And this caused problems because of the fact that a few of the people thought that she had now betrayed the working class. She was now a supervisor, so she had joined management, and caused a real bit of strife. The reality was that her influence in the hospital grew. She had a team of nurses that she was able to look after. She was able to have, quite a good say in the hospital, how it ran, the fact that the nurses would be looked after, their conditions, that they should be treated dignified, and all the rest of it. So, this idea of working class, even though I get it, we can see it as confrontational at times. I remember when Cardijn was, obviously confronting the capitalists of the day. Not all the capitalists were trying to exploit their workers. A lot of them felt, I think they were called the benevolent managers or something like that. So they were Catholic. They saw that they had, a responsibility for the welfare of their workers. But as you pointed out in your talk, the competition, this competition in the laissez-faire world meant that they had to, fight against other organisations. They would just kind of go under. And I noticed that Cardijn in the Hour of the Working Class doesn't seem to talk about the class war that Marx would have, this idea about the revolution. Or he doesn't seem to talk about that so much. I don't really have a question, but what I wanted to say was, when you were talking about your students, and you were talking about try to get your students to have to develop a sense of Christian responsibility for their work as managers. I thought that was a really important vocation that you have.
Let me, I think you brought up an important point there, and this is, and the case you were talking about, I think illustrates that. So there was two ways to handle this problem. With Marx, it's always going to be this opposition. And Marx is certainly correct, because that tension exists. John Paul, St. John Paul II, looked to a system as successful insofar as it bridges that gap. And it bridges the gap between ownership and workers. And so the manager then, the best way to do that is to somehow spread actual ownership, okay, and let the workers have responsibility for running the company. And this turns out to be very, very effective, and it gives them, in fact, a competitive advantage. Because when the workers share in the profits, okay, they are very, very, if anything, more careful than managers who, the primary product of management, of managers is management. And the more management, the more supervisors they can get working for them. And if their supervisors have supervisors working for them, well, you're even a more important manager. And so bureaucracy proliferates. But workers don't care about that. They don't need that, especially if they're doing profit sharing. That tends to overcome the gap in itself. So ownership sharing, profit sharing, those kind of things those kind of things eliminate the need for a good deal, if not most, of management. You know, turns out the workers can self-manage the process. So it sounds like with your nurse, she took those concerns and was able, even though, you know, her workers might have been suspicious, it sounds like from how the brief description you gave of the case is that she was able to bring the workers' concerns into management, if I heard you correctly. Stefan, you're turned off.
Sorry, I wanted to say that Jim's got his microphone on. So, Jim, could you turn your microphone on? We hear some background noise from your microphone, Jim. I should be able to turn it off, but I can't find the control to do it. Anyway, it's gone quiet now. We'll edit this out. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, all right. So I'm not sure. We've been going for nearly an hour and a half now. Is there any possibly one last comment or question? If not, I think it's probably we're getting close to the time where we should close. It's been a great discussion, actually, in the end. Slow to start, but lots of points that we've made. Jacob, yes, okay, you'll be the last one. Over to you.
Sorry, Stefan. Hope you guys can see and hear me. This was just reflection on.
I'm afraid you're.
At the end.
I'm afraid you're breaking up.
What we've
maybe turn off. Excuse me. Do you mind to turn off your video and try again? Because
yeah,
your voice is breaking up.
Can you hear me now? Is that a bit better?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. No. Apologies for that. John, earlier in your talk, when you were sort of talking about the kind of the lack of transcendental end that capitalism has, I think, and this is just from personal experience, having been, politically active and interested in these things as a young person, I have felt that the language that liberalism has given us isn't really capturing it. It has, like, when it revolves all around the harm principle, it isn't capturing the real poverty of what we're experiencing now. And I'm almost now going back to old words like words like compassion, mercy, honor, things that I used to hear in church and in YCW groups and YCS groups. And so there seems to be a reversion back to that kind of language, and it seems like political theorists are trying to come up with a sort of post-liberal consensus of things like high and mighty language, but like there isn't really a prescriptive idea that's coming out at the end of it. And in Australia, the Treasurer, this just kind of jogged my memory, the Treasurer, the Australian Treasurer, who comes from a Laborist political persuasion, wrote an essay where he talked about this concept called values-based capitalism, and how one of the tasks of the government is to try and infuse a sense of values within capitalism, and that for too long we've been using too many narrow concepts to measure the health of an economy, things like GDP, and instead we need to broaden that to include things like well-being, etc. I was interested in your views as to whether that is an approach worth pursuing, an attempt to try and broaden the measurements of what defines the health of an economy and how that impacts its people, and whether that would be even consistent with, say, the teachings of Cardijn.
Sure. Yes, well, the issue there is what kind of a science is economic science? Now, in the 19th century, there was an effort to move what was then called, and had been called since approximately Aristotle, political economy, into something called pure economics. And there's great irony here, because the terms economics was never, ever used. You will not find it used before 1891, with the publication of A.E. Marshall's The Principles of Economics. Now, I find a great irony in the fact that Rerum Novarum and the Principles of Economics are published the same year, because they set the terms of the debate. Now, A.E. Marshall came at the end of a long effort in the 19th century to make political economy into a purely mathematical science. Okay. Now, obviously, this is a failure, because even the libertarian has to come back to some kind of value, which he locates entirely within individualism. Okay, so long as I haven't punched you in the face all day long, okay, then everything's okay. You know, it doesn't matter whether my business has polluted your environment or destroyed your economic system, whatever. So long as, you know, individually, I haven't used coercion, then everything's okay. What happened, though, is not that they made economics a science, is that they misunderstood science entirely. Economics, political economy, is a science. It is not a mathematical science. It's a humane science. Now, the physical sciences deal with number, weight, measure. Okay, their whole thing is to get more and more precise measurements. Okay, humane sciences don't lead to measurements; they lead to better judgments. All right. So, and to understand economics, you have to understand it as a humane science, as the science of those humane relationships that are necessary for the material provisioning of society. Now, obviously, that has some mathematical aspects, but it cannot be reduced to mathematics. As a humane science, it should result in better judgments. And so the measures of mathematics are not whether GDP is growing, because GDP can be growing while society is collapsing. The measure is, can you make a judgment that families are stronger, that communities are stronger, that the environment is not being abused? So these are never precise judgments, although they rely on measurements. You can look at specific measurements like the suicide rate, are people self-medicating with drugs and alcohol? What is the percentage of families breaking up? How stable are communities? These are reasonable judgments, supportable judgments, which can be made. Those judgments are the object of political economy. GDP growth is the object of economics. Okay, but let me give you an example. I'll give you two examples of the problems with a measure like GDP growth. Take a community that has a certain level of security. Okay, but suppose for some reason, whatever the reason might be, it experiences a crime wave. All of a sudden, you're going to have to employ more police. You're going to have to build more prisons. You're going to have more lawyers, more judges, etc. GDP will go through the roof. But the output, security, may actually decline. And security is what you're trying to produce, not more GDP. But the other biggest example of that was the great migration of women from the home workforce to the paid workforce. All right. This resulted in a lot of things that had been non-monetary up to that time, leading to a great growth, an explosion of GDP. So meals that had been cooked at home. When mama cooks a meal at home, the GDP doesn't go up. When she takes them out to dinner at McDonald's, okay, the GDP rises. So women moved into the workplace. They had to hire, more home help. They had to put their children in nurseries. They had to have more packaged foods or eat out more. They had to have a second car. They had to have a bigger wardrobe. Okay, GDP rose, but the output didn't rise. Mama cooks a meal. Mama takes a meal out to a family out to McDonald's. The output is the same. Everybody gets fed, but only one results in higher GDP. Now, I'll let you judge whether the output was of a higher quality under McDonald's or under Mama. That depends on your home situation. But we can make a judgment about whether the family was stronger at home or at McDonald's. Okay, it won't be this. That judgment will not necessarily track the GDP. So those are two examples of where GDP measures don't really measure the economy.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, look, I think we've really, in a way, actually, you've kind of summed up some of the issues that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half now. So I think we better move to a conclusion. And I would just like to thank you very much, first of all, for recapping Cardijn, reintroducing him to some of us, and maybe even and also introducing Cardijn to others as well. And I think there's really, just going by the discussion, there's so many things to follow up. By the way, I will mention that many of John's talks or lectures are available on YouTube. If you look for John's name on YouTube, you'll find his channel and be able to follow up much more of his teaching. And I hope that we can follow up some of these points that we've talked about today on another occasion. So I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today. And thanks again, John.
And I'd like to thank all of you for attention, for these great questions. And this has been a very enjoyable experience for me. Thank you very much.